Friends, our scripture lesson today is taken from the Gospel according to Luke, chapter 12, verses 49 through 56. I came to bring fire to the earth, and how I wish it were already kindled. I have a baptism with which to be baptized, and what stress I am under until it is completed. Do you think that I have come to bring peace to the earth? No, I tell you, but rather division. From now on, 5 in one household will be divided, 3 against 2, and 2 against 3. They will be divided, father against son, and son against father, mother against daughter, and daughter against mother, mother-in-law against her daughter-in-law, and daughter-in-law against mother-in-law. He also said to the crowds, when you see a cloud rising in the west, you immediately say it is going to rain, and so it happens. And when you see the south wind blowing, you say, there will be scorching heat, and it happens. You hypocrites, you know how to interpret the appearance of earth and sky, but why do you not know how to interpret the present time? Well, there are a lot of different opinions on this kind of thing. I don't know what you normally do. But when you go to a restaurant and the meal comes out and it's not what you think you were getting, do you send it back? Are you a send the food back person? Okay? It's weird. It's kind of different. Maybe for a lot of people it's sometimes. It depends on how bad it really is. A lot of times it can feel like, that it's about someone's ego. For instance, sommeliers will tell you that 75% of the wine that gets sent back is actually perfectly good. It's just that the person didn't understand what the wine was supposed to taste like when they ordered it, and so that happens, so it can feel like ego. There can be a tension involved because you don't want to be that person. You don't want to be that person. You don't want to be that kind of troublemaker. And yet, my mother, for instance, who surprised me because she was never confrontational in public, she would send food back and she'd say, well, I'm paying for it. It should be it should be the way I want it to be. So there's always this kind of tension, always this kind of inconsistency. I'm inconsistent in this area in my own life. For instance, if I'm negotiating a contract with a salesperson, I will tend to be the person who wants the salesperson's shirt off their back, and then I want them to go home and get another shirt. Okay, I'll just keep going on the negotiation. But in a restaurant, I generally won't send the food back unless it is actively going to kill me. All right, give me raw chicken, and all right, and I'll say, look, you've actually got to cook this. But I love steak, and I tend to order it medium rare, and I've gotten a piece of steak that should have come with a Nike logo and laces, and I'll still try to eat it. So we always have to manage this tension between standing up for what's right and the way things ought to be, and then letting things go. And where do we draw this line? It's really difficult because Jesus gives us a teaching today which sounds pretty harsh. He gives us a teaching where he says, do you think that I have come to bring peace to the earth? Well, actually, since we call him the Prince of Peace, I think most of us say, yeah. It's kind of what we thought. He goes, do you think that I've come to bring peace to the earth? No, I tell you, but rather division. And this sounds as if this is intentional on his part, but that actually isn't the text. And one of the things we need to understand in the text is that in the Greek there are a couple of different particles that connect clauses in sentences, okay? And there are two very, very important ones in the language. And one is this thing called a Hinna Clause, and it means in order that. And so if Hinna connects two clauses, it's like, well, I am doing this in order that this would happen. A is being done in order that B would happen. But when he says that I have come to bring, do you think that I have come to bring peace? He's not using a Hinna. There's no Hinna. There's a haughty clause. And the haughty simply means with the result that. Okay? That A is going to result in B. All right? But B was not the purpose of doing A. If you were trying to say that B was the purpose of doing A, you would use a Hinna conjunction between them. All right? Instead, he's simply understanding that division is going to happen as a result of his coming. All right? That he understood that his coming was not going to just suddenly, instantly create unity and everyone would just fall in line behind him and say, yes, Jesus, you are Lord. We are all together. We are all here. He understood that division was going to result. And yet, he came anyway. It says they will be divided. Father against son, and son against father, mother against daughter, and daughter against mother, mother-in-law against her daughter-in-law. And he's saying these things. He's stating these because these are primary relationships. All right? Your family, these are primary relationships. I mean, I know that, certainly in my culture, as a Korean American growing up, right, division against your parents? No, this was, this is inconceivable, okay? So he's talking about division among your most primary, your most sacred relationships. And he's saying that his presence is going to risk that this will happen. But we also understand that some things have to be worth it. Some things have to be worth it. There's a professor, I always read what he puts out, Adam Grant. He's at the Wharton School of Business. He's an organizational behavioral psychologist, a business consultant, writes really amazing stuff. His books are phenomenal. And he addresses this because part of being a leader is having principles. You have to have a certain set of principles in order to be an effective leader. And he says, look, if your highest value is loyalty, you run the risk of compromising your integrity. Allegiance to people matters, but allegiance to principles matters more. Right? Now, this sounds good, but then when we get into the nitty-gritty, we're faced with this very fundamental tension. Allegiance to people matters. Yes, it does matter. And allegiance to principles matters more, but is this always the case? Like, does every principle matter more than every person? It gets murky. It gets difficult to parse. I mean, we all know people who are too rigid, right? We've all met people who are so rigid, declaring everything to be a matter of principle, that, they're down to like 2.5 friends left in the world because they've just decided that their rigidity is more important than their relationships. But we also know that there are certain things that have to be core. And my encouragement here, what I want to talk to you about, is really just raising within you the idea that we have to have core values. I mean, what Professor Grant says, he says, the ultimate test of integrity is what we're willing to risk to uphold our core values. Our core values. I mean, there's always going to be certain things that you will let slide. Okay? I mean, if you sent back a dish in a restaurant because the garnish was misplaced, I mean, come on. Okay? You'd say, look, well, gee, your menu had a picture and it's supposed to look like this, and it doesn't look like that. Suppose you could call that a matter of principle, but most people would say you're carrying it too far. So we have to deal with this question of really wrestling within ourselves. What are our core values? What are the things that we would never compromise on? What are the things that we would never compromise on no matter what was at stake? These are questions that we kind of need to wrestle with in order to go through life. If you don't, you risk being an unprincipled person, and we've all met some of those as well. And one of the things that I've noticed about unprincipled people is that they can't even relate to this idea of principles. Right? I don't know if you've met some. I've met some people who I really felt like they were so unprincipled, they didn't even understand the idea of principles. Okay. Like, for instance, and I've met people in the business world who were so dishonest, they didn't understand honesty. I mean, truly, like if you said something like whatever, in a business setting, and this goes back to my days before I went to seminary, in a business setting, that if you said something that was honest, but might cost you the sale, might cost your company the business, you'd have a person who would sit there and say, "Why did you say that?" And you'd say, "Because I was being honest with the potential customer, and I thought it was relevant to them, and they deserved to know this before they made a purchase decision." And you'd see the person just shake their head and look at you, and you know that what they're thinking is that you are stupid. What? You did what? You did what? You were honest with a customer in such a way that it cost you a sale? They don't even get it. They don't understand it. But sometimes, we may have blind spots like that. We always have to examine ourselves to say, okay, that's a pretty obvious situation, but do we have a similar kind of blind spot in certain areas of our lives? Do we have certain areas of blind spots where we can't even understand someone who draws that principled line where they draw it? Because at the end of the day, when I talk about drawing a line for our principles, none of us have a line that just looks like this. Okay? My line looks like a jigsaw puzzle through life, okay? It's up here for certain things, it's down here for other things, it's almost invisible for certain other things, and it's a brick wall for some things. Because I'm a flawed, imperfect human being, and I'm not perfectly consistent. Sometimes people will sit there and say, "How come you really drew the line on this, but then you were so easygoing on that?" And I'm like, "Because I'm a flawed, inconsistent human being. That's why." It's the only answer I can really give. But we do have to spend some time in our lives asking, where do we draw the line? And one of the reasons why we need to spend time doing this, and this is really one of the lessons of faith overall, is that it's when we're, for want of a better term, when we're relaxed, when things are okay, when the heat's not on. This is when you have to think about these things. This is when you have to work on your faith. This is when you have to decide where your lines are. This is where you decide what you believe in, because when the pressure's on, it's much harder to do that. This is why athletes practice, so that they can develop the skills, they can develop the reactions, they can understand what they're going to do before it's game time. Because if you get into the middle of the game and you're going, "What do I do now?" you're in trouble. And a lot of people go into the game of life not having prepared. And they get caught up. And they make bad decisions because they hadn't thought about the decisions that they would make before they got into that situation. We need to be deciding when the pressure isn't on what we would do if we were in a situation where it was to our advantage to lie, where it was our advantage to cheat. What about if it's to your advantage to cause social harm? What about if it's to your advantage to work for an unethical firm? What about situations where your ego is at stake? We have to think about these things and decide where those lines are going to be before we get into the situation that puts us to the test. Because it's preparation that helps us pass that. And the thing that we need to do to separate it is to go back to what Jesus was trying to accomplish. It is, after all, the principles of Jesus that help us discern the difference between our principles and our ego. Right? When we decide to draw the line, We have to be mindful of just saying, are we drawing the line where Jesus would want us to draw it? Because we've all known people, I think, or seen people where it sure seemed that they were drawing the line for the purpose of grandstanding. They were drawing the line because what they wanted to do was go out into the world and say, hey, look at me. Look at me. Look at me be performative here in terms of my morality. Look at me talk about how moral I am and what kind of principle I'm going to stand for, because what I really want is not to do the right thing. What I really want is for you to look at me and think I'm being great. That's not what Christ is calling for. In fact, Jesus, in doing this, is never calling us to grandstand. He's never calling us to break the relationship. When he talks about the fact that division is going to happen, it's always going to be on the other person to cause the division. You simply stand still. You simply stand for what you stand for, and it's up to them to decide. It's up to them to decide whether they're going to turn their back on you. You stand for what's right, and it's up to them. You do what's right. My analogy would be in a job. If your job is asking you to do something unethical, it's not about storming out and quitting. It's about simply saying, no, I'm simply going to I'm going to do my job right, and I'm going to do it ethically. They fire you for that. That's up to them. Right? But you can stand your ground without walking out. You can simply stand your ground and say, this is how I am going to handle it. I read a book years ago, so it's one of those things where you have a quote, and you can only admit that it's not yours, but you have no idea where you heard it from. Okay? So I have no clue where I heard this, when I heard it, but it's not mine. But it was a person pointing out, and he just put it very simply. He said, look, Jesus said to turn the other cheek, not turn the other way. Right? The person hit you, don't respond, turn the other cheek. But when you turn the other cheek, you're still looking at the person, right? You're still facing the person. You're still willing to be in a relationship with the person, but it's going to be on the right terms. It's not going to be a fight. It's not going to be a war. I'm not going to do the wrong thing. But I'm also not walking away from you. It's going to be up to you. You stand up for what's right and simply say, this is what I need to do. And I need to do it because I believe that this is what Jesus would do. How you react is up to you. And the importance of doing this in faith is what Jesus is getting at when he says, you hypocrites, you know how to interpret the appearance of earth and sky, but why do you not know how to interpret the present time? He's simply saying, you know how to speak truth in so many unimportant situations. You know how to speak truth and interpret the circumstances in things like the weather. And yet, somehow, you're not willing to just stand up and speak the truth of what you've seen and what you've known about who Jesus is. This is a great quote that we should always be reminded of from C.S. Lewis. You've probably heard it before, but he had said this. He said, Christianity, if false, is of no importance, and if true, of infinite importance. The only thing it cannot be is moderately important. It's either of ultimate importance or of no importance. It can't be moderately important. It guides us or it doesn't. But the thing I want us to leave with remembering is that it isn't the belief that's core. When Lewis talks about Christianity, all right, it's not just a set of beliefs. Christianity is a way of living, not just a belief system. Now, I'm not saying that it's not a belief system either. It is a way of living that rests on a belief system. Okay? A way of living without a belief system is just salvation by works. Okay? That's not what it is. But a belief system that isn't accompanied by a way of living is also empty. Christianity is an integration of a belief system with a way of living. It's a way of living that is intricately, completely dependent on the belief system that we hold. And so it is a way of living that rests on a belief system, and you can't have the one separated from the other. It is the two together. But too often we see people who draw that line somehow above beliefs but below actions, and that's not where it's supposed to be. That line has to be above both action and belief. It's about how we're supposed to live. And it's about us. It's not about the other. It's about us deciding how we're going to live, not judging other people, because that's not our place. But we do get to decide what we're going to be. And that's ultimately what's at stake. Because if we don't have a line, or our line is a moving target, I mean, we've had this too. I have one of my old friends. I can tell you about him, like the guy, generally good guy, but I'll tell you when it comes to ethical decisions, he will tell you that he is never, ever, ever immoral. Except his definition of what's moral changes day by day by day by day. So it's very simple. He's never immoral. He just changes his definition. And that's really tempting. If I said I never did that, I'd be lying. If I said I never rationalized my excuses for doing it, I'd be lying. But we have to think about it. We have to think about where our line is. Because if we don't, we will cave into the temptation of moving the line until our lives no longer look like the lives of a follower of Christ. Is there a cut and dried answer for you that I have? No. It's for you to think about. For you to think about what Christ is calling you to do. For you to think about where you would draw the line, for you to think about what you would be willing to risk for the sake of what you believe to be good and honorable and true, and what it means to live a life that is good and honorable and true. And then to be willing to let the chips fall where they will. Because that's what Jesus said he would do. He came as truth, to speak truth, to live truth. And where that would cause division, it would. That wasn't his intent. It wasn't his purpose. But it was an acceptable price to pay in order to be what God had called him to be. And it has to be acceptable to us as well. That we live as Christ would have us live. And the price will be whatever it will be. Amen.